They told me to move, to leave the seat I'd paid for, as if I didn't belong. But this wasn't just about a seat, it was about respect, about dignity. I've fought my whole life to stand tall. And I wasn't about to let them push me down. What started as one moment of defiance became something much bigger, a fight for justice, for accountability. And for everyone who's ever been told they're less. Before we dive into this powerful story, let us know where you're tuning in from, and if you find it compelling, don't forget to hit subscribe. The boarding pass crinkled in my hand as I approached the first-class cabin. For most, it was just a seat, but to me, it was something more, a symbol of how far I'd come. The hum of the plane's engines barely registered as I stepped into the plush section of the aircraft. My seat, 3A, was nestled near the window, and I slid my carry-on beneath it with practiced ease. Sinking into the soft leather seat, I couldn't help but think about my mother. She would have been proud to see me here, though she never would have admitted it outright. Her pride came through in small ways, a packed lunch for a long study night, a handwritten note of encouragement in my textbooks. Growing up, she worked double shifts as a nurse, sacrificing her comfort to ensure I had everything I needed to pursue my dreams. This seat wasn't just mine, it was hers too. I glanced out the window as the airport crew scurried around the tarmac, their movements brisk under the blazing sun. My thoughts wandered back to the work I'd left behind, a civil rights case that had consumed months of my life. The stakes were high. And though I was tired, I felt a deep sense of responsibility. This brief flight was supposed to be my moment of reprieve before diving back into the fray. Pulling out my phone, I scrolled through my packed calendar, each line filled with tasks demanding my attention. "You need to rest," I murmured to myself. Leaning back, I closed my eyes, letting the faint chatter of the cabin and the muffled thud of luggage overhead lull me into a rare moment of quiet. It didn't last long. "Can you believe it?" whispered a voice 2 rows behind me. "People like her in first class." I froze, my heart sinking. My mother's voice echoed in my mind, "They'll always question your place. Don't let them shake you." Taking a slow breath, I shook it off. It wasn't the first time I'd overheard something like that, and I knew it wouldn't be the last. The plane began filling with passengers, their conversations blending into a background hum. A businesswoman with a Bluetooth headset barked orders into her phone as she shuffled down the aisle. A couple struggled with a too large carry-on, apologizing profusely to everyone they bumped. The elderly woman in 3B gave me a kind smile as she settled into her seat, her floral scarf fluttering as she adjusted herself. "This must be nice for you," she said, her voice warm but laced with curiosity. "It is," I replied evenly. The boarding process dragged on, but I tried to focus on the steady rhythm of passengers moving past me. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, signaling our departure was near. I told myself I'd made it. The day would end peacefully. Little did I know. The turbulence wouldn't come from the skies, it would come from the people around me. The plane had barely left the gate when I saw her, the flight attendant with blonde hair twisted into a tight bun and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She moved through the cabin with practiced precision, but there was something in the stiffness of her posture that felt off. When she stopped at my row, her forced smile widened. "Good afternoon, ma'am," she said, her tone overly polite. "May I see your boarding pass, please?" I blinked, momentarily taken aback. My boarding pass? I'd already shown it at check-in and at the gate. The elderly woman next to me glanced over, frowning slightly. "Of course," I said, pulling the pass from the pocket of my blazer and handing it to her. Her manicured nails pinched the slip of paper as she examined it, her eyes narrowing as though searching for a flaw. The pause stretched, her scrutiny deliberate and far too long for a simple seat verification. Finally, she handed it back, her tight smile never wavering. "Just needed to check," she said, her tone sugary but sharp. Sometimes passengers get confused about their seating. Her words landed like a slap. The implication was clear: you don't belong here. I'm not confused, I replied, keeping my voice steady. This is my seat. Of course, she said with a laugh that sounded rehearsed, her smile twitching at the edges. But as she turned to leave, I caught the faintest whisper under her breath. First class isn't what it used to be. My stomach tightened, but I stayed silent, staring out the window as if I hadn't heard. My mother's voice echoed in my mind again: pick your battles wisely. This didn't feel like the time to push back. Not yet. But as the flight progressed, the tension grew. The woman's smile became sharper each time she passed my row. Drink service took longer to reach me than anyone else, and when it finally did, my water came with an accidental bump to the tray table, splashing droplets onto my lap. "Oh, I'm so sorry," she said, though her tone lacked any real remorse. "It's fine," I replied evenly, grabbing a napkin to dab at the wet spot on my skirt. I told myself it was nothing. Coincidental. Unintentional. But then, as she leaned down to speak to another flight attendant, her whisper carried over the hum of the cabin: "Are we sure she's supposed to be here?" I froze. The words burned, stinging like an open wound. This time, I couldn't let it slide. I turned my head slightly, catching the tail end of her colleague's uneasy glance in my direction. The younger attendant avoided eye contact, looking away quickly. Her cheeks flushing red. Fingers tightening around my armrest, I forced myself to breathe. I wouldn't let her rattle me. A few minutes later, she was back. Clipboard in hand. Her smile stretched so thin it looked painful. "Ma'am," she began, her tone adopting a rehearsed professionalism. "It seems there's been an error with your seating assignment. Would you mind moving to the main cabin? We'll ensure your comfort there." The words hit me like a bucket of ice water. "Excuse me?" I asked, sitting straighter in my seat. "It appears there was a mistake in the booking," she continued, her voice dripping with false politeness. "We'll be happy to accommodate you in another seat." I smiled, polite but firm. "This is the seat I paid for. If there's an error, you should check with whoever assigned it, because it wasn't me." Her composure faltered, a faint blush creeping up her neck. "It's a simple misunderstanding," she insisted, though frustration bled into her voice. "There's no misunderstanding," I said, my tone even but unwavering. "I know exactly where I'm supposed to be." The passengers nearby began to notice. A man in the adjacent row lowered his tablet, glancing curiously between us. Another leaned toward a seatmate, whispering. The growing attention only seemed to irritate her further. "Look," she said, her voice lowering, "I'm trying to resolve this quietly. We both know how these things happen." "These things?" I asked, cutting her off. "What exactly do you mean by that?" Her lips pressed into a thin line, her gaze flicking toward the passengers now watching closely. She straightened abruptly. Her frustration masked by a veneer of professionalism. "This isn't over," she muttered before turning on her heel and walking briskly down the aisle. I leaned back in my seat. My pulse steady but my mind racing. This flight was far from over, and I had a sinking feeling the turbulence had only just begun. The cabin had settled into a quiet hum, but my mind refused to follow. My conversation with the flight attendant, Emma, according to her name tag, kept replaying in my head. Her words, her tone. Even the way she looked at me, as though I were an unwelcome intruder. I wasn't imagining it. I pulled out my phone, scrolling aimlessly through emails and notifications, hoping to distract myself. But the whispering behind me kept pulling me back to reality. A pair of business travelers were muttering to each other, their voices low but not low enough. "She's making a scene for no reason. One of them said. "It's just a seat." "Why not move?" the other replied. I gripped the phone tighter, resisting the urge to turn around. I wasn't making a scene, I was standing my ground. The elderly woman beside me cleared her throat gently, and I turned to meet her kind eyes. "You're doing the right thing," she said, her voice soft but resolute. "Don't let them push you around." Her words settled something in me. I nodded, offering a small smile. "Thank you," I whispered. Minutes later, Emma returned, her forced smile more strained than ever. This time, she didn't come alone. A younger flight attendant trailed behind her, looking nervous and avoiding eye contact. Emma leaned in slightly, her voice adopting that same polite tone. "Ma'am, I really must insist that you relocate to the main cabin." I looked up at her, keeping my tone calm but firm. "And I must insist that this is the seat I paid for. If there's an issue, I suggest you take it up with your booking system." The younger attendant shifted uncomfortably, her gaze darting between us. Emma's smile tightened. "I'm trying to handle this as quietly as possible. For your sake and the other passengers' comfort." "For my sake?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Or yours?" The tension was palpable now. A few passengers turned to watch more openly, their curiosity outweighing their discomfort. "You're being unreasonable," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper, though the sharpness in her tone cut through the cabin's hum. "No," I replied, my voice steady. "I'm being firm. There's a difference." Her jaw tightened, and for a moment, I thought she might lash out. But instead, she straightened, exhaling sharply through her nose. "I'll have to escalate this," she said curtly, before turning and storming away. I watched her retreat, my heart pounding even though I'd kept my composure. The younger flight attendant lingered for a moment, looking at me with what I could only describe as guilt. "I'm sorry," she mumbled before hurrying after her colleague. That simple apology stuck with me. It was almost enough to confirm what I already suspected: this wasn't the first time Emma had acted this way. As the minutes ticked by, the whispers around me grew louder. I could feel the weight of the passengers' stares, some curious, others judgmental. A man across the aisle leaned toward his seatmate, muttering something under his breath. When I met his gaze, he looked away quickly. I tried to focus on my breathing, on staying calm. My mother's voice echoed in my mind again. "They'll always try to question your place, Maya. Don't give them the satisfaction." A soft ding signaled the start of drink service. As Emma approached my row again, I braced myself. But this time, she merely dropped a small napkin and drink on my tray without a word. The tray wobbled, spilling a splash of water onto my lap. "Oh dear," she said flatly, not bothering to hide her indifference. "It's fine," I said, brushing away the droplets with the napkin. But it wasn't fine. None of this was fine. I leaned back in my seat, gripping the armrest tightly. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about everyone who'd ever been made to feel small, unwelcome, or out of place. And I wasn't going to let it slide. The cabin lights dimmed as the flight prepared to ascend, casting long shadows on the faces of passengers around me. The tension from my earlier exchange with Emma still lingered, thick and heavy like an unspoken accusation hanging in the air. A man across the aisle leaned forward, craning his neck toward the woman next to him. "She's still in that seat," he murmured, not bothering to lower his voice enough to keep it from carrying. I could feel my pulse quicken, but I kept my eyes fixed on my phone, pretending not to hear. I'd learned long ago that reacting immediately wasn't always the smartest choice. The elderly woman next to me shifted in her seat. "Don't you worry about them, dear," she whispered, her voice steady and warm. "You have every right to be here." I turned to her, meeting her kind, wrinkled eyes. There was something comforting in her presence. A reminder that not everyone in the world was determined to see the worst in me. "Thank you," I said quietly, my voice just above a whisper. Her hand patted mine lightly, and for a moment, I allowed myself to breathe. The quiet didn't last. A man in a gray suit a few rows behind me cleared his throat loudly. "If she's not supposed to be there, why hasn't anyone done anything?" His voice carried, deliberate in its volume, as though he wanted the entire cabin to hear. "That's not how things work," someone else muttered in response, though their voice was softer, unsure. The murmur of voices grew, a low buzz of speculation that made my skin crawl. I could feel their stares, some cautious, others piercing. A few passengers had their phones out. Not yet recording but clearly prepared to capture whatever might unfold. Emma passed through the cabin again, her face carefully composed but her movements sharp and deliberate. She didn't stop at my row this time, but the slight glance she cast in my direction was enough to reignite the tight coil of frustration in my chest. From behind me, I caught another whisper. "What's the big deal? If they asked her to move, why not just move?" I exhaled slowly, gripping the armrests to steady myself. I wanted to turn around. To tell them that moving wasn't just about the seat, it was about what it represented. I wasn't going to shrink for their comfort. Instead, I kept my voice low and steady as I spoke to the elderly woman beside me. "It's not just about me. It's about what this means. If I let them do this to me, they'll think they can do it to anyone." She nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Sometimes, standing your ground is the only way to make them see." As the flight attendants prepared for takeoff, the cabin grew quieter. But the air was thick with unspoken tension. Even as the engines roared to life, carrying us into the sky, I could feel the weight of it pressing down on me. I leaned my head back against the seat, closing my eyes briefly. My mother's voice echoed in my mind again, "They'll try to push you out of spaces you've earned, Maya. Never let them win." When I opened my eyes, Emma was standing at the front of the cabin, speaking in hushed tones with another flight attendant. Her posture was rigid, her gestures sharp, as though she were trying to convince them of something. The younger attendant's gaze flicked toward me, her expression a mix of discomfort and guilt. The tension wasn't just between Emma and me anymore. It was spreading, dividing the cabin into those who looked at me with quiet support and those who watched with suspicion, waiting for the next spark to ignite. I could feel the weight of their scrutiny. But I refused to look away. This wasn't over, and I wasn't about to back down. The soft chime signaling drink service echoed through the cabin. Emma was back, her clipboard tucked firmly under one arm, her expression sharper now. She moved briskly, avoiding eye contact with me as she passed. The tension hadn't eased since takeoff, it had only grown. I could feel the eyes of the other passengers darting toward me, their whispers occasionally reaching my ears. "She's still there," someone muttered. I closed my eyes, taking a slow, deliberate breath. My mother's advice replayed in my head, "Breathe, Maya. Stay steady. Stay calm." But calm was a luxury I didn't feel I could afford anymore. From the corner of my eye, I noticed a young man seated a few rows behind me in the economy section. His phone was tilted just enough to catch Emma's movements as she approached my row. His expression was focused, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Excuse me, ma'am," Emma said, her tone clipped. "I need to speak with you about your seat." I straightened, meeting her gaze with a steady calmness that I didn't entirely feel. "Is there a problem?" Her smile didn't waver, but her tone grew sharper. "As I mentioned earlier, it appears there's been a mistake with your seating assignment. We'll need you to move to the main cabin to resolve this matter." "This is the seat I paid for," I replied evenly, pulling my boarding pass from my blazer pocket. "If there's an error, it's on your end, not mine." Her smile faltered, and for a brief moment, her frustration slipped through. "I'm trying to handle this quietly," she said, lowering her voice, though the edge in her tone was unmistakable. "I understand," I said, my voice calm but firm. "But I'm not moving." Nearby, the young man's phone shifted slightly, the lens now capturing the exchange. I could see him in my peripheral vision, his brows furrowed with concern. The murmurs around me grew louder, and more passengers began turning in their seats to watch. A man across the aisle lowered his tablet, his expression curious. Another woman leaned toward her seatmate, whispering behind her hand. Emma leaned closer, her voice dropping. "We both know how these things happen. Let's not make this more difficult than it needs to be." My heart pounded, but I refused to let it show. "What exactly do you mean by these things?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment, she seemed at a loss for words. "Look," she said finally, "I'm just trying to do my job. But if you won't cooperate, I'll have no choice but to escalate this further." The young man's phone tilted slightly, catching Emma's face as her mask of professionalism slipped further. "I suggest you do what you need to do," I replied calmly, folding my hands in my lap. "But I'm not leaving this seat." The tension in the cabin was almost suffocating now. Passengers were no longer whispering, they were openly watching, their expressions ranging from curiosity to discomfort. Emma straightened abruptly, her smile gone. "Very well," she said curtly, before turning and stalking down the aisle. As she disappeared into the galley, I exhaled slowly, trying to steady my racing heart. The young man behind me leaned slightly forward, catching my eye for the first time. He gave a small nod, his expression resolute. I nodded back, grateful for the quiet show of support. For the first time since the flight began, I felt a flicker of hope. The cabin hummed with restless energy, a quiet tension that refused to dissipate. I leaned back in my seat, trying to focus on the faint drone of the engines, but it was no use. My mind raced with the events of the past hour, each exchange with Emma replaying in sharp detail. I noticed the younger flight attendant from earlier hovering near the galley. She glanced at me. Her expression conflicted, before quickly looking away. I didn't need to hear her speak to know she was uncomfortable. Emma's actions weren't sitting right with her. Then Emma returned. Clipboard in hand, her steps deliberate and purposeful. Behind her, the captain followed, his face a mask of polite professionalism but with a hint of weariness in his eyes. "Ma'am," Emma began. Her tone clipped and formal, "This is Captain Wilson. He'll be assisting with the seating issue." I looked up at him, my gaze steady. "Good afternoon, Captain," I said, keeping my voice even. "Good afternoon," he replied, his tone cautious. "I understand there's been some confusion regarding your seat assignment." "There's no confusion," I said, holding up my boarding pass. "This is the seat I paid for, and it's clearly stated on my ticket." The captain's gaze flicked to Emma, who stood rigid beside him. She opened her mouth to speak, but he raised a hand to stop her. "Ma'am," he said to me, "I want to resolve this peacefully. If there's been a mistake, we'd appreciate your cooperation in moving to another seat so we can address it." I tilted my head slightly, studying his expression. He was trying to stay neutral, but I could sense his discomfort. "Captain," I replied, "I understand the importance of keeping a flight running smoothly. But this isn't about a mistake in seating. This is about how I'm being treated." His jaw tightened, and for a moment, he looked like he wanted to respond. But a voice interrupted from a few rows behind me. "She's right," a woman said loudly, standing up in her seat. It was the elderly passenger who had offered me encouragement earlier. Her voice was steady and firm. I've been watching the whole time, and this is unfair. The cabin fell silent as passengers turned to look at her. Emma stiffened, her lips pressing into a thin line. Another voice chimed in. Yeah, why's she the only one being questioned? This time, it was a man from across the aisle, his tone incredulous. Emma's mask of composure cracked, her eyes narrowing as the murmurs around us grew louder. The captain raised a hand for quiet, but the tide was shifting. I glanced behind me and caught the eye of the young man who had been filming. He gave me a small nod, his phone still angled discreetly toward us. Emma leaned closer to the captain, her voice low but audible. This is getting out of hand, she hissed. We need to get her out of that seat before it escalates further. I heard her words, but before I could respond, another passenger spoke up. She's not the one escalating things, the woman said. Her arms crossed. Maybe you should look at how you're handling this. Emma flushed, her composure unraveling further under the growing scrutiny. The captain sighed, running a hand over his face. Enough, he said firmly. We'll discuss this in the galley. He motioned for Emma to follow him, and she hesitated, her knuckles white around the clipboard. Finally, she spun on her heel and followed him down the aisle, her steps sharp and deliberate. As they disappeared into the galley, the cabin erupted into murmurs. Passengers whispered to each other, their voices filled with outrage and curiosity. I could feel their support growing, like a wave building behind me. The elderly woman sat back down, giving me a resolute nod. You've got people on your side, she said softly. I met her gaze, feeling a swell of gratitude. For the first time, it felt like the tide was turning. From behind me, the young man with the phone leaned forward slightly. I've got everything on camera, he whispered. If they try anything else, I'll make sure the world sees it. I nodded, my voice low but firm. Thank you. The tension in my chest eased slightly, replaced by a quiet determination. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was bigger than that. And I wasn't going to back down. The plane had settled into a strained silence, but I could feel the tension simmering beneath the surface. The passengers' whispers and glances were no longer just curiosity, they had become something stronger, something restless. I wasn't sure if it was support or skepticism, but either way. The air was charged. Emma hadn't returned since the captain called her into the galley. I imagined their conversation wasn't going well. A part of me wanted to believe she'd come back with an apology. But the stubborn set of her jaw earlier told me otherwise. As I sat there, the young man in coach caught my attention again. He leaned slightly into the aisle, his phone still in hand. The lens pointed toward me. He wasn't hiding it anymore, and neither were the other passengers who'd pulled out their devices. This wasn't just a moment, it was a spectacle now. A story unfolding in real time, and the audience was growing by the second. Excuse me, the man said softly, leaning closer. I'm Michael, by the way. I've been recording everything. This isn't right. People need to know what's happening. I looked at him for a moment, his earnest expression softening the tight knot in my chest. Thank you, Michael, I said quietly. I didn't ask for this, but, if it helps someone else, it's worth it. He nodded, his phone still steady in his hand. It will help. Trust me. A few minutes later, the captain emerged from the galley, his face set in a tight, neutral mask. Emma followed closely behind, her clipboard clutched like a lifeline, her knuckles white. She wouldn't meet my eyes. But I could see the frustration radiating from her every step. Ladies and gentlemen, the captain began, his voice calm but firm, we appreciate your patience as we work to resolve a seating issue. We ask that you remain seated and allow us to handle the matter appropriately. The murmurs grew louder, the unease in the cabin palpable. I could see it in the passengers' faces, the ones who had been whispering, the ones recording, the ones who had spoken up earlier. They weren't buying it. Emma stepped forward. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Ma'am," she said, her voice tight with forced politeness, "this is your final warning. If you refuse to move, we will have no choice but to involve airport security upon landing." A sharp intake of breath rippled through the cabin. I stayed seated, my hands folded in my lap. My heart pounding but my voice steady. "That won't be necessary. I've done nothing wrong, and I'm staying in the seat I paid for." Emma's composure cracked. Her voice dropped, cold and venomous. "People like you always have to make everything about race," she hissed under her breath. The words hit me like a slap. For a moment, the cabin seemed to freeze, the air sucked out of the space. I sat straighter, meeting her gaze with a steadiness I didn't entirely feel. "What exactly do you mean by, people like me?" I asked, my voice cutting through the sudden silence. A ripple of murmurs spread through the cabin. Passengers shifted in their seats, leaning closer to hear what would come next. Michael adjusted his phone, the lens now focused squarely on Emma's face. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, but no words came out. The mask she'd worn all flight had completely crumbled, leaving only anger and frustration behind. "She's right," someone said loudly from a few rows back. It was the elderly woman again, her voice unwavering. "This has nothing to do with a mistake. You're singling her out, and we all know it." Another passenger, a man in a business suit, spoke up next. "It's clear she's being targeted. Enough is enough." Emma turned to the captain, her eyes pleading, but he didn't speak. His silence spoke volumes, and the growing murmurs of agreement around the cabin only fueled the fire. The tension was unbearable now, the weight of it pressing down on all of us. Emma's hands trembled as she gripped her clipboard, and for a moment, I thought she might lash out. Instead, she spun on her heel and stormed back toward the galley, muttering under her breath. As she disappeared, Michael leaned forward again. "It's all on video," he said, his voice low but firm. "Everything. She can't hide from this." I nodded, exhaling slowly. "Good," I said softly. "Let them see it." By the time the flight landed, the video was already making waves online. Michael had uploaded the footage mid-flight, and social media was ablaze with outrage. Hashtags like #FlyingWhileBlack and #JusticeForMaya trended within minutes. Messages of support, anger, and solidarity flooded my phone as I stepped off the plane. Emma was nowhere to be seen. And the captain avoided my gaze as I exited the aircraft. But I knew this was far from over. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about something much bigger. And I was ready to fight. By the time I reached the airport terminal, my phone was vibrating non-stop. Texts, calls, and notifications poured in as the video Michael uploaded gained traction. The comments were a mix of shock, outrage, and solidarity. "She paid for that seat, disgraceful behavior by the airline. This isn't the first time this has happened. Time to call out systemic racism in the skies. I've flown with them before, and this is exactly why I stopped. Enough is enough." I scrolled through the messages, my heart pounding with a strange mixture of anger and resolve. This wasn't just my story anymore. It was resonating with thousands, maybe even millions of people. As I walked through the terminal, I spotted Michael standing near baggage claim, still holding his phone. He gave me a small wave, and I walked over, grateful for his quiet solidarity. "It's everywhere," he said, holding up his phone to show me the video's view count. Over 100,000 views already, and it's climbing fast. I nodded, the weight of it settling over me. "Thank you for standing up for me," I said sincerely. Michael shrugged. a faint smile tugging at his lips. It's not just for you. It's for all of us. Before I could respond, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was an unknown number. I hesitated but answered. "Mess. Carter, this is Laura Simmons from the airline's public relations team. We've been made aware of the incident on your flight, and we'd like to apologize for any discomfort you experienced." Discomfort? I repeated, my voice sharper than I intended. What I experienced was blatant discrimination. Laura cleared her throat on the other end of the line. "I assure you, we're taking this matter very seriously. We'd like to offer you a travel voucher as a gesture of goodwill and to resolve this issue quickly." I laughed bitterly, drawing a glance from Michael. "A voucher? You think this is about a free flight?" "Ms. Carter," Laura began, her tone growing more cautious, "we want to make this right." "Then start by addressing the real problem," I said firmly. "This isn't just about me. It's about the way your employees treat passengers like me. This is systemic, and it needs to change." There was a long pause on the other end. "We'll investigate further," Laura said finally. "Thank you for your feedback." She hung up before I could say more. I stared at my phone, frustration simmering just beneath the surface. Michael shook his head. "They're just trying to cover their tracks." "Not this time," I said, my resolve hardening. "They can't sweep this under the rug." As we left the terminal, more headlines and social media posts began flooding in. Stories from former employees and passengers started surfacing, painting a picture far worse than I imagined. One ex-flight attendant shared her story in a video that quickly went viral. "I worked with Emma Reeves for 3 years," she said, her face pale but her voice steady. "And this isn't the first time she's targeted a passenger. Complaints were filed, but management always brushed them off. They said she was stressed or that it was a misunderstanding. But it wasn't." The video sent shockwaves across social media. Other former employees chimed in, echoing similar stories of neglect and complicity. A passenger from a year ago shared their own experience. "Emma told me my seat had been double-booked and made me move, even though I had proof it was mine. I didn't fight back because I was too scared of causing a scene. Seeing what happened to Maya Carter makes me wish I had." The narrative was shifting. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about an airline that had allowed behavior like Emma's to go unchecked for years. My phone buzzed again, this time, it was a reporter requesting an interview. Then another. And another. The weight of the attention was dizzying, but I knew I couldn't back down. I turned to Michael. "They wanted to silence this," I said, holding up my phone. "But now, it's too big for them to control." He nodded, a determined glint in his eye. "What are you going to do next?" I didn't hesitate. "Hold them accountable. Not just for me, but for everyone they've done this to." As we stepped outside into the brisk evening air, I felt a surge of clarity. This fight wasn't just mine, it belonged to everyone who had ever been made to feel small, invisible, or out of place. And I was ready to see it through. The weeks following the flight felt like a whirlwind. The video Michael uploaded had now been viewed millions of times. With hashtags like #JusticeForMaya and #accountability in the airline trending globally. Social media was a storm of outrage and solidarity. People were sharing their own experiences of discrimination. And civil rights organizations had started reaching out to me. But the airline? They were scrambling. I sat across from my attorney, Carla Mason, in her brightly lit office. She was sharp. No nonsense, and exactly the kind of person I needed for what I was about to do. "They're already offering settlements," Carla said, sliding a folder across the table. "Travel vouchers, free flights. Even a sizable cash payout if you agree to sign a non-disclosure agreement." I shook my head, pushing the folder back toward her. This isn't about money, I said firmly. They want to sweep this under the rug, but they can't keep getting away with this. I want accountability. Policies need to change. Carla smiled faintly, leaning back in her chair. I thought you'd say that. And honestly, that's why this is going to be tough. They'll fight tooth and nail to avoid admitting fault. A public trial isn't what they want. Good, I replied. My voice steady. It's what they need. She nodded, jotting down a few notes. We'll build a case around the video and the testimonies coming in. Former employees and other passengers are already speaking out. It's not just Emma, it's a systemic problem. If we play this right, we won't just hold them accountable. We could change the way they operate entirely. Her words sent a shiver through me. This fight wasn't just about a single flight or a single seat. It was about creating a system where no one else would have to go through what I did. The following week, we filed the lawsuit. The media swarmed outside the courthouse as we walked in. Cameras flashing and reporters shouting questions. Carla stood beside me, calm and composed, but my heart raced. Ms. Carter, what are you hoping to achieve with this case? One reporter asked, shoving a microphone toward me. I paused, glancing at Carla before turning back to the reporter. I'm not just fighting for myself, I said, my voice clear and unwavering. I'm fighting for everyone who's been silenced, dismissed, or made to feel less than. This isn't just about one flight, it's about accountability, dignity, and respect. The crowd erupted in questions. But I didn't stop to answer them. My focus was on the courtroom ahead. Inside, as we took our seats, Carla leaned toward me. You've already won part of the battle, she said quietly. The world is watching. That's the kind of pressure they can't ignore. I nodded, clutching the folder in my lap. This was just the beginning, but for the first time, I felt a flicker of hope. The airline might have thought they could bury this story, but now, they'd have to face it head-on. The courthouse was quiet now, the echoes of footsteps fading as the doors closed behind me. The air outside was crisp, carrying with it a faint hum of city life, but my mind was elsewhere. I clutched my bag tightly, replaying the words of the closing statements in my head. Carla had been right. This wasn't just a fight, it was a spotlight. The trial had brought to light a culture of negligence within the airline, a pattern of complaints brushed aside, voices silenced. Emma's actions weren't isolated. They were a symptom of something much bigger. The judge's decision wouldn't come for weeks, but in many ways, I felt like we'd already won. The public had seen the truth. And that was a victory in itself. I walked toward the car waiting to take me back to my hotel, but halfway there, I stopped. The courthouse steps seemed impossibly long. And the weight of the past weeks bore down on me. I sat down, my hands resting on my knees, and let out a long breath. For the first time in weeks, I let myself think of my mother. Her laughter. Her steady hands holding mine, her voice full of quiet wisdom. You'd be proud of me, wouldn't you? I whispered to no one in particular. A memory surfaced, a cold winter night when I was 10. I'd come home from school, upset after being teased for speaking out during a class debate. I'd told her I wanted to stop raising my hand, that it wasn't worth the ridicule. She'd knelt down in front of me, her hands on my shoulders, her eyes fierce but kind. Maya, she'd said, if you don't stand up for what's right, who will? Sometimes the world isn't fair. But that doesn't mean you stop fighting. Those words had stayed with me, guiding me even when the road felt impossibly hard. As I sat there, lost in thought, a familiar voice broke through. You okay? I looked up to see Michael, his phone nowhere in sight for once, his expression kind but curious. Yeah, I said, managing a small smile. Just thinking. He nodded. Sitting down beside me. You've done something amazing, you know that? I glanced at him, the weight of his words sinking in. It doesn't feel amazing. It feels exhausting. Michael laughed softly. That's how change feels sometimes. But you've inspired a lot of people. Including me. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the truth in his eyes. It wasn't just my fight anymore, it was a movement. I hope it's enough, I said quietly. It is, he replied. It already is. That night, I visited my mother's grave for the first time in months. I stood there under the stars, the air cool against my skin, and let the silence envelop me. I did it, Mama, I said softly. I stood tall, just like you taught me. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying a sense of peace I hadn't felt in weeks. As I turned to leave, I realized something important. This fight wasn't just about the injustice I'd faced, it was about making sure no one else had to endure the same. And for the first time, I felt at peace.